This video will have spoilers for Season 2 of The Boys. We will be discussing politics. I will let you know before I start talking about concrete spoilers for the show, but it's best you finish the season before watching the video. Season 2 contains very on-the-nose depictions of fascism, as well as countless on-the-nose allegories for today's political climate. They're about as subtle as a Las Vegas billboard. We'll talk about them later in the video, but first, we have to talk about fascism. We see the idea of fascism invoked colloquially all over media. News, video games, movies, television shows, and so on. I think it's safe to say that fascism is squarely entrenched in the cultural zeitgeist. Maybe it's been that way since the days of George Sorel, Gabriele D'Annunzio, and other pre-fascist thinkers. Fascism, when invoked in today's culture and discourse, is very often used in a messy manner, applied to a whole host of things that are very different but sharing some common characteristics. Its meaning has become very diffuse. Today we call outright Nazis fascists. Some will call people like Elon Musk a fascist. People even call anti-fascists fascists for their tendency to be involved in violence. People call the President of the United States a fascist. People call measures against the pandemic fascist. The word's meaning in the pre-war years during fascism's heyday weren't entirely clear either. That's why we have some arguing for fascisms that are far different from others, with fascism in each country taking on characteristics unique to the politics in the moment of those specific countries. When the layman talks about fascists in an academic manner today, more often than not, they're talking about people espousing the ideology of Mussolini's Italian fascism. We're using the term in a generic manner, though. We're talking about a generic fascism. More on that later. In The Boys, we see a number of different characters that people would probably use the word fascist to describe. Some of them are obvious, some not. We also see interactions between what I describe as non-fascist characters and fascist characters that are very interesting if you've read the book Nature of Fascism by Roger Griffin. We'll be referring to that one quite a bit during this video. Coincidentally, he's the first I've seen at least coin a definition of generic fascism. So, first of all, let me explain in very basic terms Roger Griffin's definition of generic fascism. Fascism is a genus of political ideology whose mythic core, in its various permutations, is a palingenetic form of populist ultranationalism. It's a lot of big words. So in simple English, fascism is a specific type of political ideology that contains a mythic core of a mass movement for hyper-nationalist national rebirth. There's a little bit more to it, and we'll delve into that when necessary. The book is 321 pages long, so I can't really cover all of it. Now, massive spoilers ahead. Do not continue watching unless you've watched The Boys Season 2. You have been warned. We'll examine 5 characters and how they relate to the various criteria we use to define generic fascism. Those characters are Homelander, Stormfront, Stan Edgar, Bailey Butcher, and Huey. All of these characters' motivations are very clearly emphasized in the final episode of Season 2. Let's start off with the biggest, most bombastic character of the show, Homelander. Homelander clearly has fascistic trappings. He is literally an embodiment of American national myth, of American exceptionalism. He's clearly a nationalist who dreams of the good old days of America, when things were simpler. This is the core of his national myth, the good old days. He also, in a literal sense, manufactures an enemy through the supervillains, with some help of Stormfront, of course, more on her later. But is it revolutionary? I'd say it's conservative, and definitely authoritarian. But while he dresses himself in the political style of fascism, with its bombastic nationalist rallies and talks of imagined enemies, this does not necessarily make him a fascist, at least not on its own. Homelander is an ultra-nationalist and in many ways seems to be made to represent the American government, America's national myths, and its attitudes towards the world and its citizens. He's narcissistic, and he is sad. If the showrunners were trying to code him as fascist, they would have done so more overtly. How can we draw this conclusion? Well, Stormfront. Stormfront is a literal Nazi from literal Nazi Germany who espouses literal Nazi ideology. Her name also stems from a literal neo-Nazi forum. During Season 2, Stormfront starts to buddy up to Homelander. Roger Griffin says that fascism is unable to become the center of extra-systemic political energies unless the political environment has given rise to currents of non-fascist ultra-nationalism. That is Homelander. Without Homelander, Stormfront cannot become the center of political energy. She cannot turn its myths into components of a revolutionary ideology. Homelander was talking of his manufactured enemies, the supervillains or the soup terrorists, before Stormfront was even really introduced. When she was, she immediately utilized that tool in her fascistic political strategy. Roger Griffin says that fascism requires adequate political space in a modern society undergoing a structural crisis. In The Boys' America, the structural crisis is the appearance of super terrorists, and the disappearance of Vaught's monopoly on superheroes. Fascism requires an inadequate consensus on liberal values, a society where people aren't entirely too sure whether or not its democratic institutions and its democratic way of doing things are the right way, where people are more likely to accept subversions of its institutions and the use of measures previously considered beyond the scope of its democratic procedures, such as sending people to kill these manufactured enemies without the legal backing to do so. Executing revenge killings instead of legally apprehending a criminal would be an example of such subversion of the previous existing procedures. We see this stuff happening all the time before Stormfront really becomes the center of attention. So if we agree that Stormfront is a fascist and that the circumstances for the rise of her fascist movement were pretty good for her, why didn't it work? Roger Griffin has an answer to that too, which is also illustrated in the show. We'll get to that later. But before then, we have to talk about the rest of the characters. Stan Edgar clearly spells out his motivations in the final episode of The Boys. He is a collaborationist capitalist, like those of industries inside and outside of occupied Europe during the Second World War. It's not ruthless, it's prices per share. You can of course both be fascist and capitalist. There's for sure contradictions between the motivations there, but it's not like fascism has ever been without internal contradictions. Belly Butcher's ideology boils down to soups are monsters and should be killed. His mission is to kill Homelander, then the next superhuman, then the next, and then the next. He has no real end goal in mind. His only method is violence. He's uncompromising and ruthless. You could describe fascists in the same way, but what separates Butcher from a fascist? Well, for one, there's no mass movement. There's no real revolutionary quality to his ideology. He's angry, like fascists are, but he lacks basically everything else. Fascists want to whip up crowds into a frenzy, but Butcher can barely keep the boys together. Butcher is an extremist, but not a fascist. He's a terrible person, but he's one of the good guys. Now, finally, we come to Huey. Huey is a moral and all-around good guy. So why is he tagging along with extremists who we'd clearly call terrorists if we were on the opposing side? Because Huey always does what is right. Huey exposes the show's moral core. What the showrunners believe is right and good. Huey knows that Butcher doesn't always do what's right, but to him, the right thing is to help him and to fight with the rest of the boys. So, in the end, how come fascism loses? With the circumstances so perfect for fascism's rise in the boys, how come it lost? Well, Roger Griffin has a few answers for us. The obvious one is that fascism is inherently a loser ideology. Quoting again from The Nature of Fascism, "The utopia which fascism seeks to implement will never be realized in practice, only a travesty of it. Fascism cannot win. It's a self-destructive force that after seizing power will inevitably collapse on itself due to its inherent contradictions." But more clearly, Roger Griffin gives us the answer in Chapter 5 of Nature of Fascism, where he outlines abortive fascist movements in interwar Europe, meaning fascist movements that never really got off their legs. Homelander is a parafascist. He's an almost fascist. In every country in Europe where the parafascist radical right was stronger than the fascist radical right, the parafascists crushed or absorbed the fascists. We see this in Austria, Romania, Hungary, and Spain. The moment Homelander and Stormfront began their relationship, they were engaged in a battle for whom would come out on top. In the end, it was Homelander. Though Homelander never destroys Stormfront's fascist movement, in the end it was the anti-fascists, the boys, but mostly the girls and Ryan, who took down Stormfront. A group of people who were willing to, or rather forced to, resort to methods that go beyond the procedures of democracy, as the regular pathways had been blocked by the machinations of Vought for capitalistic profit-motivated reasons, and Homelander for authoritarian para-fascist reasons, and Newman for as-of-yet unrevealed reasons. The Boys Season 2 is a story of an abortive fascist movement, an analogy with all the subtlety of a hand grenade for modern-day America, in which the current government and America's fascist movements engage in the same song and dance as Homelander and Stormfront. And I would really like them to stop.